So we're continuing to look at the general issue of authority data in this first session, and information about people is also of great interest to the university community. And for example, there's now a strong emphasis by universities on more open exposure of their research outputs and on providing more information about the researchers themselves. And there are a number of universities in Australia that have projects underway in this area. Simon Porter is going to describe these developments based on his experience at the University of Melbourne, where he is the information manager of the eScholarship Research Centre. And Simon works on the Australian Find an Expert database and is exploring collaboration with the National Library's People Australia project. And I tried to say that as slowly as I could. So when we're finished setting up here, I'll ask you all to make Simon welcome.
Okay.
Simon, over to you.
Lovely. For anybody who was annoyed by that English language thing there, I've tried in vain and cannot get it to disappear. In fact, I've now made it more prominent on the screen. I'll hide it back up here. Okay. Oh, that's in a very bad position. Just skim it over. So once upon a time, all you needed to know about a university could be found in a book. And that book was the university calendar. I spent a nice couple of hours recently, went to the University of Melbourne Library and pulled out several volumes of the calendar, and I was astounded to find that in 1870 it really was the entire university. You had all staff, all students. At the back of it you had exam papers, you had fee schedules. You could pretty much find everything you needed to know about the university in that book. As the complexity of the university grew, the books grew bigger. So I just did a brief count. The number of pages used to list all university staff in 1870 was 16 pages. That, by the way, was staff and students. In 1934, it was 39 pages. 56, 54 pages, 69, 112 pages. 1990, 137 pages. By 2004, 227 pages. And they weren't the same size books. They were very small books to begin with, and they ended up being A4 books with very small print. So the story is larger than that. Although the books got bigger, the scope of the story contained within the university calendars got smaller. So in 1870, you had a story about the entire university. 56, it was somewhat smaller. You could see that parts of it were being taken out. Obviously, probably even by the 30s, you'd no longer find exam papers in the university calendar. By the 1990s and 97, we'd actually stopped publishing them as public documents, and they became more an internal communication mechanism. There was still something called the university calendar, but it didn't really have the same gravitas as it used to do. And you could tell that these were really public documents in the 50s, because if you open them up, the first thing you say is how to donate money to the university. So clearly, they're public documents. They're there to actually promote the university. That's clearly something that did not persist through time. So what does the university calendar look like today? Well, in 2007, the university calendar is increasingly just a brand for a collection of online resources. Some of these resources look reasonably the same as they did. That's a 1956 university calendar entry, and you can see that's listing teaching staff, and it's got a list of members type of feel. There's pages in that 2007 list of members that actually list the non-academic staff, the professional staff in the university, and it looks more or less the same. However, because universities are very complex, some things about the university calendar look remarkably different. So if you want to find out who the current teaching and research staff are, and you go to the list of members, you'll actually be referred out to the home pages of the staff and faculty profile sites. So no longer a book, no longer a consolidated set of references, but actually more a transient reference to finding out what the current state of a university looks like. This, for people like me and many of you in the audience, is probably somewhat disturbing. So why is it important to tell a story about the demise and the importance of the university calendar? Well, for one thing, and in the area that I work in, the Scholarship Research Centre, university calendars are really important for providing a contextual framework for history. One of the projects that's emerged in the last couple of years, Anne Westmore was a historian of medicine. She was got a small grant from the University of Melbourne to celebrate their 150 years recently to actually provide a compendium of the history of the Faculty of Medicine. And what she did was she had all of these stories about the Faculty of Medicine, whether in history books. She went out and spoke to people who were involved with the Faculty of Medicine. But what she used the university calendar for was to pull out the people, the organisational changes, and structure that history around those identities. So in the same sort of way that Tom was able to pivot a story that was built up from individual stories of individual records around identities, Anne was doing the same thing using the information from the university calendar as a primary source. So university calendars in the past provided an excellent reference to contextualise the framework of our university history. And because we've been able to lift these identities, these people that really did exist in the university in faculties that had a particular name at a time, and we've been able to lift them into the online space, there becomes a time when we can actually pop them into a more national record so that they can actually become part of the national history. So one of the things that Anne Westmore was really excited about when she created the history of the Melbourne was that it was an open history. Here she created a framework that listed all the people and the organisations, and people could come to her and say, well, actually, I've got a story about the Faculty of Medicine that I'd like to add. If we lift that back up to the national level, we can actually start collecting those stories, not just through Anne and her compendium, but by appropriately labelling and assigning metadata to records, we can start increasing that history. So here's the question that I wanted to pose. What resources in the future will frame a university's history? And I think there's a historical component to that question, but there's also a current component to that question. What resources today frame a university's identity now? How do we uniquely identify researchers against publications? How do we uniquely identify researchers against data and repositories? And what techniques can we use to publicly expose the university structure today? This is not a doom and gloom story, by the way. It's a story of hope, because although university calendars have increased in importance, at the same time universities have been getting better at managing information about their research identity behind the scenes. So a local story at the University of Melbourne. In 2003, our institutional knowledge of researchers was stored in, a community of silos. We had information about what grants people were on in the finance system. We had information on what grants people were on in the research system. They weren't connected. We had stories about publications, about qualifications in our research system. We had similar stories about person details and qualifications in our HR system. We had stories about research students in our student system. And since 2003 was the evolution of, started to mark the coming out of open access, we had publications stored in our ePrint system and out in faculties and departments on web pages. We had a replicated story of qualifications, grants and publications. However, by 2005, our institutional knowledge of who we were was actually starting to consolidate. In the one system in Themis, our enterprise system of record, we had person details, qualifications, grants and publications. We no longer had an individual record in our research system. We no longer had bits and pieces stored all over the place. We still had that information replicated on faculties and department websites, but we had enough information in one spot to start to tell a really nice story about our researchers.